There are men who do not leave because their feelings ran out. They leave because the feelings grew into something they did not know how to live inside. And tonight, I want you to sit with something that most people never fully understand, because there is one trait, one quiet and almost invisible trait that causes a man who loves you with everything in him to keep his distance. Not because you failed him, not because the connection was not real, but because of something happening entirely within himself. You may have already felt the particular confusion of this, the silence from someone whose eyes once carried something unmistakable when they looked at you, the sudden coldness from someone who used to make you feel like the most important presence in a room. Stay with me, because what you are about to understand may completely reshape the way you see love, distance, and the complicated inner world of the human heart. There is a kind of love that does not settle quietly into a person's life. A love so consuming that it shakes the ground beneath a man's sense of self. Most of us grow up believing that love naturally draws two people toward each other, that the stronger the feeling, the closer together two people will move. But what psychology actually reveals is something far more complicated and far more true. Sometimes the deepest love is what creates distance before it ever creates closeness. Sometimes a man does not pull back because his feelings weakened. He pulls back because they became too strong to manage from the inside. Carl Jung spent much of his life writing about what he called the shadow, that hidden dimension of the human soul where fear lives, where old wounds quietly wait, where unspoken truths and buried insecurities make their home. And when a man falls genuinely in love, not just with how a woman looks or the way attraction feels, but with the actual soul of another person, his shadow stirs. Suddenly, the battle is no longer with the outside world, it is with himself. Because most men have spent their entire lives learning how to survive rather than how to feel. From the time they were young, many were conditioned to believe that emotions are liabilities, that vulnerability leads to loss of control, and that attachment makes a man weak. So, when real love enters their world, it does not simply warm their heart. It tears open every wound they spent years carefully burying under silence and routine. A woman in this situation often believes his distance means he lost interest, but the truth is usually far more painful than that. He became distant because being near her made him feel too much, and the one single trait responsible for that distance is emotional intensity. Not anything she did or said, not a flaw in her appearance or her character, simply the intensity of what rises inside him when he is around her, an intensity that frightens him in ways he cannot explain even to himself. A man who loves deeply is not usually afraid of losing the woman he loves. He is afraid of losing himself inside the emotional experience she awakens in him. There are people you can be around who make life feel easy and predictable, who fit neatly into your sense of order. And then there are people who reach the parts of you that you stopped visiting years ago, the parts you hid not because they were shameful, but because they were too tender to leave unprotected. When a man meets that kind of person, something begins happening in him that he was not prepared for. His thoughts grow louder and harder to turn off. His fears sharpen into something almost physical. His longing becomes the kind that does not wait patiently. Every exchange carries weight. Every silence feels like it is asking him something. Every possibility of rejection starts to feel like a threat to something vital inside him. And so rather than moving toward her, he begins to pull back. The cruelty of this is that most women read that retreat as indifference when what it actually represents is emotional overwhelm. A man who feels nothing remains relaxed. He can be casual, easy, unbothered. But a man who truly loves is psychologically exposed in a way he has never been trained to handle. And exposure is one of the most frightening experiences for someone who spent decades building invisible walls around his inner world. That is why some men become colder after the moment their feelings go deepest, not because the warmth disappeared, because the warmth became so intense they could not stay near it without feeling completely out of control. They begin studying every word they say before they say it. They second-guess every gesture. They become terrified of revealing too much, of needing too much, of showing a degree of feeling that might expose the full scope of their attachment. And quietly, without fully understanding what they are doing, they manufacture distance as a way of surviving their own emotions. There is a painful contradiction that lives inside the deeply loving heart. The more completely a man loves, the more vulnerable he becomes to being shattered by loss. And vulnerability is not something most men were ever shown how to hold. Society builds monuments to the composed man, the controlled man, the man who does not falter. But nobody builds anything for the man sitting awake at 3 in the morning because someone's voice will not leave his mind. Nobody teaches him how to carry a love that refuses to be quiet when he needs sleep. Nobody gives him a language for the fear of losing someone who has become, without any formal agreement, emotionally sacred to him. So he reaches for the only tool that feels available: silence, distance, withdrawal. Because distance, at least, is something he knows how to create. There are nights when a man like this disappears, not because you stopped meaning something to him, but because he is trying to find his footing again inside feelings that have grown too large for him to stand inside comfortably. He replays conversations in the quiet of his own mind. He sits with the strange reality that your absence affects him more than almost anything else in his daily life. He turns it over and over, trying to understand how a single person's presence can simultaneously calm him and undo him. And the deeper the bond becomes in his interior world, the more unsettling his dependency on it feels. This is what emotionally intense love does. It creates profound confusion before it ever creates clarity. The soul recognizes the connection immediately and moves toward it. But the ego panics because it understands that this kind of love, if allowed to take root completely, will change everything. There are men who carry wounds into love that predate you entirely. Betrayals from people they trusted, abandonment they never fully processed, humiliations they never spoke aloud, forms of emotional neglect that shape the way they learned to protect themselves long before they ever met you. Those old injuries do not dissolve just because love arrives. In fact, real love has a way of reactivating them. When someone genuinely matters, every scar that has been quietly resting suddenly becomes alert again. The fear of not being chosen returns with new strength. The fear of not being enough grows louder. The fear of being fully opened and then left grows into something almost unbearable. And so, rather than risking that kind of exposure, many men unconsciously begin to create breathing room between themselves and the person they are most afraid of losing. They tell themselves they simply need time to think. They convince themselves that a little space will restore their perspective. But what they are actually attempting to outrun is the enormity of their own emotional experience. The human mind works in strange and often self-defeating ways. We develop the habit of fleeing from exactly what we most deeply want. Jung understood this. What we resist internally does not weaken. It simply moves underground and governs us from there. For many men, genuine love sets off a chain of interior battles they never saw coming. They may carry themselves with complete composure publicly, while privately being consumed by the emotional weight of someone who has become everything to them. A man can project total emotional unavailability while spending every night before sleep thinking about the same woman. He can behave as though nothing is happening while carrying an attachment so deep it quietly reshapes his entire sense of what his life is for. This contradiction is one of the most disorienting things in human relationships, because what you observe on the outside and what is actually occurring on the inside are frequently telling completely different stories. What hurts most deeply is that many men genuinely believe creating distance is an act of protection, not self-protection alone, but protection of the woman they love. They believe they are doing her a kindness by keeping their emotional chaos away from her. They fear becoming a burden. They fear falling short of what she deserves. They fear the instability of their own unprocessed feelings spilling into something that damages what they care most about. So they withdraw. They go quiet. They hope that the silence will somehow settle what is happening inside them, but feelings that are pressed down without being addressed do not simply dissolve. They grow in the dark. They gather weight. And in time, the distance itself begins to cause its own kind of suffering. There is something almost spiritual about being deeply loved by someone who cannot bring themselves to say so. Their silence holds hidden storms. Their eyes carry confessions their mouths have never formed. They look at you sometimes in ways that feel like recognition, like arriving somewhere familiar, and then moments later they close off completely and retreat back into themselves. This can feel like cruelty if you do not understand what is underneath it. But in most cases, it is not cruelty at all. It is survival. A man who was never given tools for managing deep emotional experience will instinctively reach for distance the moment his feelings begin to exceed what he can regulate on his own. And the most quietly devastating part of all of this is what it produces. Many connections end not because love ran out, but because fear got louder than communication. Two people can exist in the same love while living in completely different interpretations of it. One person experiences the silence as rejection. The other creates the silence as a form of shelter. One is longing for reassurance. The other is hiding emotion out of fear of what will happen if it is seen in full. And gradually, the whole connection becomes buried under accumulated layers of pride, anxiety, unhealed history, and everything that was never said. This is why emotional maturity matters more than the intensity of feeling alone. Love without self-awareness becomes its own kind of damage. You must understand something about men who love with great emotional depth. Their care is rarely partial. When they are in, they are completely in. But because they feel with that same completeness, the fear of emotional loss lives in them with equal intensity. They may appear removed from the outside while being profoundly and helplessly attached from the inside. They may show almost nothing outwardly while internally craving closeness every single day with an ache they would never admit to in daylight. The struggle is not a shortage of feeling. The struggle is an inability to regulate how enormous that feeling becomes without it eventually overwhelming everything else. A man who loves deeply pays close attention in ways he will never announce. He registers the subtle shifts in your mood before you have named them yourself. He holds on to details about you that you said once and immediately forgot. He carries the texture of your presence into the ordinary hours of his life and says nothing about it to anyone. Music reminds him of you. The particular quality of quiet on certain evenings reminds him of you. Something is always slightly incomplete without you in it, even when he is doing everything possible to appear otherwise. But because emotional intensity feels to him like standing at the edge of something with no railing, he keeps all of this concealed behind a behavior that reads as distance. He fears that if he allows the true depth of his attachment to become visible, he will lose whatever fragile control he still has over his own interior world. And maybe that is the most essential truth in all of this. Loving someone deeply is not just a feeling. It is a psychological event. It is transformation. It forces wounds that have been carefully managed for years back to the surface. It exposes the insecurities a person spent decades learning to work around. It challenges the carefully maintained story that a person is emotionally independent and fundamentally okay on their own. And most people are not actually prepared for what it costs to love someone at that level. They anticipate the warmth and the pull and the feeling of being chosen. They do not anticipate the identity disruption, the quiet terror, the kind of awakening that looks from the outside like withdrawal. Even men who carry themselves with great strength can become emotionally fragile in the presence of love that is genuinely real, not because they are weak, but because authentic closeness removes the armor that strength was partly built to maintain. And underneath every suit of armor is a human being who wants to be known without having to earn that knowing. The problem is that most men were never given language for emotional overwhelm. So instead of finding a way to say that loving someone feels like standing in a current too strong to stand upright in, they go quiet. Instead of admitting that losing you is the specific fear that sits underneath all their other fears, they perform unavailability. Instead of letting you see that you have become the kind of person who matters too much for them to be casual about, they disappear. If you have ever loved someone like this, you already understand the particular exhaustion of it. One moment you feel like you are reaching the truest part of someone, and the next moment that same person seems to have moved to a completely different country inside themselves. Their inconsistency does not mean they are dishonest. It means they are not yet aligned with themselves. Human beings are rarely simple. The passage says that emotional withdrawal is often driven by unresolved fear, trauma, and shame rather than lack of love, causing some people to distance themselves from deep connections they care about because they lack the emotional tools to handle vulnerability. There is a kind of loneliness that lives inside many men that almost never gets discussed. A loneliness created specifically by years of being told, in ways both direct and indirect, that emotional openness is not safe, not acceptable, not what is expected of them. They were shaped to produce, to compete, to achieve, to endure. They were not shaped to feel openly without shame. And so when deep love finally arrives in their life, it collides with years of conditioning that pulls in exactly the opposite direction. One part of them wants to surrender completely to the connection. Another part is still fighting to maintain the emotional self-sufficiency they spent decades constructing. And that internal collision is often what produces the confusing behavior on the outside. You may notice that men who love most deeply sometimes maintain a kind of watching from a distance even after the relationship has technically ended or paused. They stay quietly aware of whether you are okay. They think about reaching out far more often than they ever act on it. They carry the connection even when they appear not to, because genuine emotional bonds do not simply end when proximity ends. The soul retains what the conscious mind is working hard to release. Real connection leaves a kind of permanent imprint that no amount of deliberate forgetting can fully erase. But here is what sits underneath everything else. Love by itself is not enough if fear is running the relationship from behind the scenes. Emotional depth without emotional courage becomes a form of slow self-sabotage. Eventually, a man has to make a choice between continuing to let fear write the story or developing the maturity that genuine intimacy actually requires. Because love cannot survive permanently inside silence. Eventually, truth has to be spoken. Vulnerability has to be risked. The walls that were built for protection have to come down, at least enough for something real to pass through. Otherwise, even the most powerful connection eventually suffocates under the weight of everything that was never expressed. And perhaps you are listening to this right now because there were nights when none of it made sense to you, when someone who clearly cared for you became distant in a way that felt like erasure, when their silence hurt more than an outright rejection would have. When you spent more time than you would like to admit, wondering what you did wrong or what you lacked. But hear this clearly. People show you the condition of their own healing through the way they behave when love arrives. Some people stay and communicate. Some people fight. Some people run. Some people disappear without explanation. Every response is telling a story about something that began long before you entered the picture. A man who has done real emotional work does not see vulnerability as a threat to his identity. He understands that allowing himself to be genuinely known by another person is an act of courage, not surrender. He moves toward honest communication rather than away from it. He remains emotionally present even when remaining present is uncomfortable. But a man who has not yet done that work continues to respond to emotional intensity as though it were danger. The deeper he feels, the more the feeling begins to resemble a threat. And until he chooses to face that pattern directly, he will likely keep repeating it, not only with you, but with everyone he ever loves. Life has a way of bringing certain people across our paths, not only to love us, but to show us to ourselves, to pull the parts we buried furthest down back up toward the light, to force us to feel what we have been very carefully avoiding. This process is painful for everyone involved, but it is also the specific kind of pain that produces real growth, which is something no comfortable situation ever produces on its own. The truth is that many people are simultaneously starving for deep connection and terrified of it. They crave the experience of being truly known while protecting against the vulnerability that being known requires. They want love while dreading the abandonment they are sure will eventually follow it. They long for someone to see past the performance while doing everything possible to ensure the performance continues. This contradiction is at the core of so much human suffering. The walls we construct to protect ourselves eventually become the very thing preventing us from living fully. If a man truly loves you at that kind of depth, his distance is rarely the simple thing it appears to be. Beneath it, there is usually longing and confusion and emotional overload and old wounds that never healed properly, and a silent internal battle you may never have any window into. This is not an argument for chasing someone who keeps choosing to stay away. It is not a reason to lose yourself in the project of healing someone else, but it is a reason to extend more understanding to human behavior than appearances on their own would justify. Sometimes the coldest exterior holds the most unreleased warmth. Sometimes the greatest physical distance is covering the deepest emotional attachment. And perhaps that tension, painful as it is part of what makes human love so permanently interesting. We are all moving through life carrying histories we did not choose, childhood wounds that shaped our definitions of safety, old heartbreaks that altered the way we learned to pace our trust, insecurities so familiar we stopped recognizing them as anything but facts. And when real love arrives, it lands on all of that at once. Some people rise into it, some people retreat from it, but what love always does without exception is reveal us, strip back the versions of ourselves we constructed for public consumption, and show us what is actually there underneath. One day, a man who has spent years running from emotional depth may finally arrive at the understanding that love was never his enemy. That feeling deeply was never a weakness to be managed. That the vulnerability he feared was always the door to the only kind of connection actually worth having. When that understanding finally arrives, he may look back at all the distance he created and see for the first time the full cost of it. Because emotional avoidance never actually protects anyone. It only postpones the reckoning while guaranteeing that the person doing the avoiding arrives at it more alone. The soul does not want surface. It wants truth. It wants to be met fully and without performance by someone willing to be equally fully present. And the people who change our lives permanently are rarely the ones who entertained us. They are the ones who made it impossible for us to keep pretending we were not feeling anything. So if someone once carried a love for you that they could not bring themselves to speak, do not make the mistake of reading that silence as an absence of feeling. Sometimes you were simply more emotionally significant to a wounded heart than that heart had the tools to hold. Sometimes your presence woke up exactly what that person had been working hardest to keep asleep. Sometimes the connection went deep enough to frighten someone who had only ever learned to treat depth as something to be careful around. But never lose sight of this. Love reaches its highest expression not when two people are endlessly circling each other's fears, but when both choose to grow beyond those fears together. Real love asks for something from us. It asks for honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. It asks for presence, even when presence requires courage. It asks us to stop running from the very intensity that makes it worth having. Because the truest tragedy in love is not that it ends. The truest tragedy is letting fear talk you out of the one connection that had the power to change everything. And somewhere tonight, there are people separated not by the absence of feeling, but by the inability to cross the distance their own fear created. Souls that belong in each other's presence, hidden behind walls that were built from pain that was never theirs to carry alone. Hearts full of ocean, presenting as empty. And maybe that is exactly why this found you today. Because some part of you already knew what you needed to hear. A man who loves you with everything in him sometimes keeps that distance for one single reason. The emotional intensity of what he feels is strong enough to awaken both love and terror inside him at once. And only the ones who finally find the courage to face their own hearts will ever understand that the connections worth most in this life are not the ones to survive. They are the ones to finally stop running from.